Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Update Extra, giving you the extra information and tidbits to get your teeth into, to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. I've already been speaking for half an hour and realised I hadn't pressed start for the record, and I'm absolutely gutted, so I've just wasted half an hour of my life. I'll never get back. Let's go and look at what Justin Bronk, writing for the Royal United Services Institute. He's a bit of an expert on air defense or on air forces. And he is talking about Typhoons here. So Typhoon, the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is the European collaboration to create a fighter that has... So let's have a look. There's service in 7 nations: UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and Austria. And it's, you know, a collaboration between different people. There are lots of different variations. And when he starts talking about tranche 1, tranche 2, tranche 3, tranche 4, these are kind of the different levels of development of the aircraft. So tranche 1 is just initial operational capability, basic air defense capability. And then it gets added onto, and so on and so forth. Anyway, Justin Bronk is reacting to the UK saying it will give jets to possibly, or they're not off the table. And the idea is like, well, what jets could we give? So some people are saying, shouldn't we give Eurofighters? Some people are saying we should give Tornadoes, but Tornadoes, we've kind of butchered all the Tornadoes and cannibalized them and given the parts to Germany. And actually they're quite difficult and not the right plane to use either. And he here says, actually, the Eurofighter Typhoon isn't the right plane, and UK is not the right country to give them, particularly, and for these reasons. So for those who on the Give Ukraine Tranche 1 Typhoon train, since the question has been asked, the RAF does not have 53 serviceable Tranche 1s to give. There are far fewer, around 20 to 25, and those remaining have much more limited combat weapons capabilities than a Tranche 2 or Tranche 3. Typhoon is not optimized for low altitude AA, so that's kind of low altitude flying, but would need to fly low near the front lines in Ukraine due to Russian surface to air missile threat. So it's not optimally designed for low altitude warfare and flying. And so therefore it's not optimized for the kind of work it would need to do in Ukraine. Typhoon is not suitable to operate from dispersed, quite short and rough air bases that the Ukraine Air Force have used to avoid Russian missile strikes. So the air bases in Ukraine are pretty rugged, you know, a bit short as well, and they would suit something like the Swedish Gripen rather than the Eurofighter. The RAF Typhoon force is badly overstretched already. Too many operational commitments with too few aircraft and inadequate spares and munitions stocks. That's the story of the UK Armed Services, too overstretched. Even a handful of Tranche 1s for Ukraine would use up lots of those scarce spares, engineers and airframes. The value of any Tranche 1 gift would be almost purely symbolic rather than a practical and sustainable Ukrainian Air Force asset. This like the main reason to give them will be to kind of oil the machine for the rest of the world starting to give jets or whatever, you know, to get the ball rolling. That symbol might be worth it if it politically enables Sweden to supply Gripen C or another party to supply F-18. So it's exactly what I was saying. And almost lastly, the Typhoon and F-16 aren't suitable for Ukrainian Air Force bases at present due to the rough surfaces and FOD. Not quite sure if Ford. No, that's FOB. Not sure. And resurfacing them to make runways suitable will make them obvious and immediate targets for Russian missile strikes. So a very serious hit to already badly overstretched RAF frontline capability. Worth it for largely symbolic gesture? Maybe, but only if others do follow with more suitable types and the RAF gets urgent funds to replace the donated jets, spares, weapons and specialists. Interesting point. So I doubt you're going to see UK Eurofighters being given to Ukraine anytime soon. This is quite a distressing video to watch, but it does tell us a couple of things. Russian soldier ended up under heavy artillery fire. Understands it may be his final video. So I'll play that and just sort of talk about a couple of points that come up from this. So he's already fairly badly injured. He says, "Hi, everybody. We got into a brutal bloodbath." So already we know. So this tells us that the Russians, in certain places at least, are having a very bad time. They've taken a real beating in this exchange. We got into a brutal bloodbath. We got properly effing beaten. Here is my leg. And he turns the camera around, shows his leg, which you can't quite see, but there's blood and stuff. It looks very, very badly injured. No effing help at all. And then an artillery shell comes in, right? And his reaction to this is very interesting. F knows if it's our artillery or not. F knows if it's our artillery or not. In order for him to say that, that means he's used to or knows that it's not infrequent that they get hit by their own artillery. Now, we've heard this from other intercepts and videos that the Russians do hit their own, whether they do it because they're incompetent or because they don't care and they're firing so close to the front line that both troops are fighting around there and they don't care whether they hit their own. I don't know. He continues. No one's pulling us out. This is the last remaining argument. And he holds up a hand grenade. That's his last remaining argument. So if someone comes across him, then that's what will happen. And it's he's kind of given up. All right, love you all, he says. We got busted hard. And that's the end there. So that was, just a little insight into the desperation of war, of course, and, the terrible reality of war. But also the idea that the Russian artillery do hit their own, seemingly, and that the Russians are taking a beating in certain places, at least. Right, I was prompted by this pro-Russian guy on my threads. Why haven't you watched this 5-hour interview with Naftali Bennett, the Israeli Prime Minister? Well, A, I didn't know it had happened, so stop hassling me. And B, I've got other things to do other than sit and watch that for 5 hours. And why haven't you watched it? Anyway, whatever. Here's a little summary of some parts of it, and it did turn up in the news. So reading about it, it was interesting because there's been this claim that the Americans have had vetoed a peace deal. They put a stop to it, and this came from the interview. But the problem is, as you'll see, it's actually a bit of a mistranslation. So, and he says it's unsure there was any deal to be made. Anyway, so and it came about. Musk got involved on Twitter talking about this and saying, talking about peace deals and whatnot, and sort of sticking his nose in. And after this interview drew the attention of Musk, says the insider here, the former Israeli Prime Minister himself went on Twitter to correct some of the commentary. It's unsure there was any deal to be made, Bennett said in response to Musk. At the time, I gave it roughly a 50% chance. Americans felt chances were way lower. Hard to tell who was right. He continued, it's not sure such a deal was desirable. At the time, I thought so, but only time would tell. The comments echo Bennett's remarks in the interview, while noting that some of Israel's allies disagreed that a peace agreement was a good idea in March 2022. Bennett said that all were aware of what he was doing. Quote, anything I did was coordinated down to the last detail with the US, Germany and France, he said. But he noted some believed it would be better to keep striking Putin, lest he or other leaders be emboldened by a seeming desire for peace at any cost. The next exchange is what went viral. The interview, conducted in Hebrew, includes English subtitles on YouTube. According to the translation, the interviewer asked Bennett, so they blocked it? Basically, yes, they blocked it, and they blocked it, and I thought they were wrong, Bennett responded. The English subtitles are flawed, however. In the exchange, Bennett and the interviewer did not use the word blocked, rather stopped, referring to ongoing peace talks, not an agreement. So the idea here is that people got onto this and said, the US has blocked an agreement, as in they've made an agreement and the US vetoed that peace deal. And it's like, no, that's not what happened. That's a mistranslation, this article is saying, because actually the word is stopped and not blocked. And basically, they just stopped going through with the peace agreements. And he later goes on to say what stopped the peace agreements, like what stopped that conversation. And Bennett says, I can't say if they were wrong. It is also not clear that any countries other than Ukraine and Russia would have been in a position to veto a peace agreement. The US and others can supply Ukraine with weapons and other aid, but they cannot force Ukrainians to fight. And as Bennett said in the interview, he was but a mediator between Kyiv and Moscow, which was also engaged in discussions at the time along with the Ukraine-Belarus border. The Biden administration insists that it supports Kyiv's decision to either keep fighting or negotiate a settlement. More recently, Ukrainian officials have described any talk of a ceasefire as a ploy by Russia that would allow it to more time to rebuild its military ahead of a new offensive. They've ruled out conceding any land seized by Russia since 2014, when Moscow illegally annexed Crimea and sent regular forces into eastern Ukraine. In the interview, Bennett himself notes that it was not the US, France, or Germany that put an end to any peace talks. Rather, it was Russia slaughtering hundreds of civilians in a town outside the Ukrainian capital, a war crime discovered just about a month after the full-scale invasion began. The Bucha massacre, once that happened, I said, it's over, Bennett recalled. In other words, what effectively vetoed any further peace talks, what stopped the peace talks, was the massive war crimes that Russia were involved in. That, Ukraine were like, no, we're not too keen on that, and America were like, okay, that's pretty bad. So it's not like anyone blocked these peace talks from happening. They just stopped. So I think that's really important to get that right. And I'm sure there's lots more in a 5-hour interview that's worthy of comment, but I've got other things to do. But there you go. And this same guy said this on one of my videos that is really problematic, and I'm going to call it out, and not just picking fights with trolls or whatever, but actually this is hopefully a learning point for you all. That sounds a bit condescending. You know what I mean. He says, I just watched a part of your video where you report on an intercepted call and a description how Russians are killing Ukrainian POWs. You report on that, and yet not a single word about a video taken by Ukrainians where they took a video of how they kill a Russian POW, shots in the head. I'm sort of making that English not its first language. Hopefully I'm getting that the sense of that right. Disgusting propaganda from you, Jonathan. No, you're not being biased. You're now Goebbels level propaganda. Okay, thanks for comparing me to a Nazi. I appreciate that. So here's the thing, right? In war, every side will commit war crimes, almost certainly. Second World War, every side involved in the Second World War committed war crimes. Heck, you trying to explain the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Goodness me. That's the nature of these things. Like, to expect Ukraine to go through this entire war without committing to a single war crime is absolutely unrealistic. The point is that is seeing the kind of scale of this. And how do you represent that scale when you're doing a job of like reporting this to the general public, as I'm doing? Now, what this guy here, Predsednik77, is doing is actually a sort of fallacious position or fallacious technique called false balance, or both sidesism. You saw this like, they're good guys on both sides, and you're like, really? I mean, they're all Nazis. And you have this with climate change is a really good example. So the BBC got into a lot of trouble some years back when they were giving they thought they had to be fair and balanced, which is part of their charter. So they do have to be fair and balanced, but it's a false balance. So you'd have like stuff on climate change, and they'd give 2 minutes to the climate change scientists and 2 minutes to the climate denialists. But the problem is climate science has like 97% consensus behind it, and denialism has like 3% non-consensus behind it. So that's a false balance. That you almost need. So giving 2 minutes to each side, it should be like 2 minutes to this guy and like 2 seconds to this guy, and if that, it needs to be proportional to the position they're upholding. Like getting on a flat earther, every time you talk about the globe on the news, you shouldn't have to get on a flat earther to say, but on the other hand, we might not actually be living on a globe, we might be living on a flat earth. It's like, that's ridiculous, right? So you don't give the same amount of time to every single competing narrative and every single competing claim and position. Now, in this case, I accept that there will be Ukrainian war crimes taking place. and that's terrible, and they should be investigated, right? And I'm not condoning that. Of course, I'm not. What I'm saying is that if you've got, from months ago, it was over 50,000. Goodness knows what it is now. If you've got, I don't know, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 claims of Russian war crimes, and you've got a handful of Ukrainian war crimes, then I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time telling you about Ukrainian war crimes, because that is a false balance. I'm not involved in both sides of them. I want to give you a proportional sense of what is going on. And when you have war crimes involving civilians, when you've got children being sexually assaulted, which we've got cases of, when you've got torture, death, so on and so forth, the whole gamut, the whole range of war crimes are being perpetrated by the Russians, give or take, right? And to a degree that is absolutely morally abhorrent. And yes, there will be some cases of Ukrainian war crimes, but it is neither is it kind of premeditated and kind of advocated by the command structures within the Ukrainian military in the way that it appears to be in the Russian, is just an entirely different scale. And so I think really what this guy here is doing, it's just a really naive. I mean, I'm, with all due respect, Pred said Nick 77, and I say that seriously because I'm not sure there's any respect due for this position. But that's a really naive position to take. And yeah, hopefully that sort of clarifies that. Here, however, we have a brilliant criticism. So this is someone involved in good faith dialogue. We don't have capital letters, 78 question marks, and yada, 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 and me being called a Nazi. We have, dear Jonathan, today I'm quite unhappy with this news edition. 3 points, I need more explanation from you. I love this because this is what I'm all about. SK says, fire in the oil refinery. So this is yesterday. I did a video where I showed there's a fire in an oil refinery in Russia. And I said, apparently, this is what you want. You want to hit the Russian infrastructure. And he says, hits on certain infrastructure we call a war crime, e.g. when they happen in Ukraine by Russian forces. I, speaking for myself, can accept and agree to attacks like this in Russia, though this can easily get morally unjustifiable if it subsequently causes severe harm to civilians. To me, such targets, if they only slow down the war efforts or the economy or the aggressor, are legitimate targets. I personally would even plead for official legitimacy of attacks one-sided against certain infrastructures of the aggressor when he is clearly named, such as in this case by the UN. Again, English might not be his first language, so hopefully I'm getting the sense of what he's trying to say. Then the attack on this oil refinery would perhaps be considered lawful. Don't know what the current international rules of warfare state. I would appreciate to learn your personal attitude on this topic. So first of all, let's just have a little think about war crimes. If Russia are claiming it's okay to hit infrastructure, then it's okay to hit Russian infrastructure. I mean, that's a bit tit for tat. You could call that a two-cock-way fallacy. It doesn't really, like, let's work out first of all whether hitting civilian infrastructure is a war crime. But it's interesting, you know, if Russia are happy with it being not a war crime, then that should be fine. They can't complain when their own energy infrastructure gets hit. However, third parties can look at that and say, actually, it's still a war crime in both cases. So Reuters talked about this last year. They said power infrastructure has long been considered a valid military objective as long as it supports an enemy's army's activities. Now, you could argue with the Russian oil refinery, it's both supporting the military campaign with oil and energy, but also that money that comes in is supporting a government that is spending an inordinate amount of money on the military project. So you could argue that. Even if the system also supports the civilian population, writes military law expert Michael Schmidt in the Articles of War blog run by the Lieber Institute for Law and Warfare and in the United States Military Academy West Point. As Russia's strikes on the power infrastructure have intensified, it seems increasingly unlikely that its armed forces can name a definite military benefit for each attack. Simply put, Russian forces are most certainly striking many targets that do not qualify as military objectives, Schmidt argues. So this is to say that it could well be argued to, quite successfully to be a military target in the case of the Ukrainian one. The Ukrainian on the Russian oil refinery. It continues, even if some of the targets could be considered military objectives, that is not the end of the story, says Catherine Fortin, Associate Professor of International Law at Utrecht University. The military must consider whether the damage and loss incurred by civilians in such attacks are excessive compared to the concrete and direct military advantage, she said. In this instance, the incidental loss of life and injury to civilians that can be expected seems very large, given that the power outages are making it impossible for surgeons to carry on their work, affecting people's access to healthcare and creating conditions in which vulnerable people are dying due to cold or hunger. Now, the difference here is this is an oil refinery and not a power station. So you can make a big difference there. It's not powering hospitals that will affect civilians. But the thing is, like, laws and rules, I've talked about this before, are constructed by us. They don't exist out there, and we don't like discover them, or we don't like do things in tune with things that are objectively true out there, because they're not objectively true. So we create them ourselves and we generate them from our own minds. And when we agree on them, we write them down. Like the Geneva Convention is just a bunch of learned guys getting together and writing a bunch of rules that they think are a good idea. Everyone agreeing with them. Might have taken some time for them to sort of, crack them out and agree on the nuances. But once they were sort of written down, it was like, right, everyone, you need to sign to this. Everyone signs to this, but it doesn't mean they can't be changed. It's like the Constitution. It's not some kind of natural law, natural inalienable rights. It's actually a bit of a problem because they're not. They are agreed upon, which is why you have amendments. They're agreed by the people that wrote the Constitution, and they've been amended because they weren't good enough to begin with, which, you can change these things. You just have to have like super majorities and whatnot in Congress or whatever. But these things, don't think that they're written in stone. And the thing about binary laws in terms of like a war crime is that, or any kind of law, arguably, is that they're generally rules of thumb. But life isn't kind of black and white. It's very grey and rough, and some rules don't always apply to any given context, and it can be really complicated. And for example, you talk about like how old you need to be to vote, for example. So in Britain it's 18, in other countries it might be 21, in other countries 16. Like, who's right? Who's to say that someone who's 19, who's actually quite immature and not very knowledgeable, is in a better position to vote who's someone that's 17 but actually really mature and knows a hell of a lot about politics and is really enfranchised and knowledgeable? So yeah, you have these kind of rules of thumb, and you put these binary laws down maybe that actually don't capture the reality of life. But anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that the Geneva Convention might say one thing, but that's, as you can see here, is still open to interpretation. So the laws are open to interpretation. You have one legal expert disagree with another. This is why you have constitutional law experts who will disagree with each other on what the Constitution says. You write these things down, but the language is still there, and there's still this layer of interpretation. The reality here is that hitting an oil refinery, you could argue, in Russia, you could probably successfully argue that is a war crime, but you could also successfully argue that it isn't. And I would need to know all the data involved in what the strike looked like. I don't even know whether it was a strike, actually. It might have just been a fire, Russian smoking incident. But assuming it was like a drone hit or something like that, or a missile hit, then, did they use a right missile? Did they had to factor in, collateral deaths and so on, and what the gains? And you have all these calculations, but still, once you've got all that information, where's a metric for judging whether that is acceptable or not? And again, that's still like kind of rough. That's not written into it. Doesn't say in the Geneva Convention if 37 people die against like $15 million of like losses towards the military, then that's a war crime. That kind of granular information is not in there. So it's just a massive bunch of interpretation. I don't know that particularly answers your question, but I would say that's broadly acceptable, especially given Russia. I know it sounds a bit like, well, you've done that, so I can do it. Two wrongs don't make a right. But there is this. I err on the side of that being acceptable. Personally, I think they're at war, and technically, Ukraine should be allowed to hit Russia with everything it's got in a military sense. But they're being very careful about the border, because the more they go over the border and attack the border, the more you rile the Russian public. And once the Russian public are behind the Kremlin, then you've got a whole load more million of people that are going to be willing to go and fight. So there's a really careful calculation that's being made there. So it's about very surgical precision strikes on military targets or infrastructure targets that are not going to overly affect civilians. So hitting an oil refinery will affect civilians down the line, maybe with like production of this and the cost of oil, maybe, et cetera, and I don't know. But it's more likely going to affect the government and the war effort more directly. And then he goes on to say, fire in Latvia, either partisan, this is what I said. So this is the American company that had a drone manufacturing point in building facility in Latvia, which is in the Baltic states, very close to Russia, has a lot of pro-Russian sympathy, but a lot of anti-Russian sympathy. And that was on fire. And I said, either this is partisan or an outright kind of sabotage from the Russian agents. And he says, that's a bold statement. Bold should not be too offending, or on the other hand, clear speech is typical German. So this guy's obviously German. I prefer when you put the uncertainty in front of such claims. The above statement, unfortunately, sounds initially very biased, close to dishonest information. Speculations based on preconditions should be made cautious and after initial unbiased reporting. No. What I get here from what he says, what I think he's saying is that I need to very much more clearly label when I'm speculating, and I was speculating there, and he's absolutely right. However, I think I had pretty good justification for that. So we know in Bulgaria the Arsenal munitions factory has been attacked a couple of times by FSB agents. How often do Latvian manufacturing facilities go up into massive fires? We're at a war, Russia are at war with Ukraine, and that facility was making drones to give to Ukraine. There are pro-Russian sympathizers in Latvia, and there are Russian FSB agents in Latvia. I mean, those things are that's known, right? So it is circumstantial, but it's joining the dots and giving a pretty plausible conclusion. So I should definitely say, yeah, this is my speculation, but I would also bet my bottom dollar that was either partisan or FSB activity. And I would still stand by that. So I'd have no problem making those bold claims as long he's right, as long as I qualify that with this is like there isn't necessarily primary source evidence that this is Russian activity. And I won't go on to the next one because I haven't read it yet, and I've got many other things to do, but I will come back to that, I think, in another video. Thank you so much, SK. Hopefully that's answered you to some degree. What do I have time? How? Because I've banged on almost half an hour. Goodness. Right, let's talk about the unfolding offensives and counteroffensives in Ukraine. So this is Michael Kofman and Ryan Evans on their War on the Rocks podcast. Really good podcast. Okay, this part from the podcast is about mobilization and manpower advantage. I think it's worth listening to.
Afford major losses, much less than the Russians can at this stage in the war, perhaps, or am I wrong?
So I think that's all right. And I think one of the biggest differences this year versus last year is that Ukraine does not enjoy a manpower advantage over the Russian military.
Why did that change? Is it just the mobilization? Ukraine's a big country. There's more people to mobilize, I would assume, more people to train, more people in their training pipeline. What are the limitations there? I know some of this we don't really understand because the Ukrainians don't talk a lot about this.
Sure. There's not great clarity on the state of Ukrainian forces. On the Russian side, it's very clearly mobilization. And also introduction of wartime measures, right, which began to deal with their refusing problem. If you remember, they had units depleted from personnel who refused to be deployed, who would quit the military, and there wasn't much they could actually do to force them to fight. On the Ukrainian side, there's still ongoing mobilization at least anecdotally. I get the sense that they're still mobilizing personnel over the course of January, but there are issues in terms of manpower available for the force because some percentage of the Ukrainian population had likely left. Men were not allowed to leave technically within a certain age bracket, but within that available population of sort of men of service age, those who wanted to fight obviously had the opportunity to sign up to fight over the course of the past year. And so I think increasingly you end up mobilizing personnel of somewhat lower and lower quality. I think in general, though, looking at Bakhmut and looking at the units deployed there, I think there's been some good anecdotal evidence just in the past 2 weeks that suggests that Ukraine had somewhat reconfigured the force presence there. And you see a lot of the units holding Bakhmut are actually territorial defense, National Guard, and Foreign Legion, with infantry brigades more in reserve. I'm not saying there are no regular infantry units there, but the more you look at it, the more it begins to appear that Ukraine actually is very conscious about force preservation. And they probably are working hard to have a sizable percentage of the force set aside for the offensive operations they want to conduct. And it kind of increasingly looks like both sides are actually not fighting for Bakhmut remotely with their best troops. I'm being a bit categorical here, but this is the impression I'm starting to get. On the Ukrainian side, when it comes to force structure,
so I think that's really interesting in terms of ideas around mobilization, but in terms of Bakhmut there, both sides are not using their best troops because actually they're keeping their best troops for coming offensives. The Ukrainians for their own counteroffensive, and Russians might be using Wagner where they can and then adding others into that, but then they are hoping to punch further north in Kremna area, maybe around Seversk, and so they're not using their best troops around Bakhmut. I find that quite interesting. There's another little bit from the podcast that talks about sort of intentions. Let's look at that. See what they have to say.
They've not yet been rotated into this war. And are they going to function as a reserve? Are they going to function as replacement units? What exactly is the Russian military envisioning to be their task?
For Putin, it seems like, and we talked about this in the last episode, putting Gerasimov back in that job as the overall commander of the war formally signaled that he's not willing to just play defense, that he wants to play offense. And we know through that, as well as other things that we've heard and been told and seen, that Putin has still not given up on the more maximalist goals of the war. But it seems like perhaps the best Russia can accomplish, and it's all contingent, yada, 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 it can go lots of different ways, is really to just freeze the conflict as the war drags on, inflict enough losses on Ukraine so they can't conduct more offensive operations, and hold on to parts of the Donbass and parts of the south. Do you think that's fair?
My sense of it is that the minimum that they want to accomplish right now is to take the Donbass. Their challenge is Donetsk, the main region they don't control in the Donbass, is also the most heavily fortified one, right? And it leads to this force matchup where, on the one hand, yes, the Russian military is now defending a much shorter front, and it has easily double the forces they had in Ukraine back in October. So much higher force density relative to the terrain they're trying to defend. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces do too. And even though their manpower hasn't dramatically increased, a lot of their forces are concentrated over the same space, right? So the challenge grows to some extent for both sides. I very much doubt that Putin's willing to accept something less than the Donbass, which he sort of titularly claimed as the original goals of this entire invasion, even though we clearly know that was actually about taking control of Ukraine. And that's why people like Gerasimov seem attractive, that their view that they can actually deliver a major offensive operation look much more appealing relative to the much more realistic but clearly unappealing perspective of generals like Surovikin, who thought the Russian military should pursue primarily a defensive strategy and let Wagner kill themselves trying to take Bakhmut, essentially. So what's the best that Russia can accomplish? Probably some sort of, let's call it a stalemate or what have you, at least in the interim period of this war, where they're holding lines not too dissimilar to the current line of control. That's likely the best for them. Maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, but I'm actually skeptical that they can achieve their minimal war aims. That is, I rather doubt that they can capture Donetsk, especially based on how they've been performing.
So let's talk about the tanks.
So that's where I leave it. I think that's fascinating, and I generally agree with that. And then I'd refer to many war analysts who would say the side that wins the war is the side with the biggest economy. And when you add all the economies of NATO together and all of Ukraine and their allies, and then compare that to the economy of Russia, it's arguable whether you need to include China in that, and Iran maybe, but just Russia versus all the other people who are arming Ukraine very directly and very directly giving money, in a way that that China isn't, then Russia don't have a chance. Like, just look at it like that. So Russia's only chance is that all of these other nations just give up and stop putting in that money, because history will tell you the winner of this war will be the country with the biggest economy. And that's not to say that that's Ukraine's economy. That's a combined economy of Ukraine and her allies. But yeah, fascinating. I don't think they do have much chance of getting anything more than the Donbass. And I don't think, like he was saying then, that they're even going to get the Donbass. Okay, very quickly look at Michael McFaul, who was a diplomat and academic. Michael McFaul says this is back to the argument that it's NATO's fault that this war started. NATO provoked Putin. Some inconvenient facts for those incredibly still arguing that NATO provoked Putin to invade Ukraine. When asked if Russia should join NATO, here's what one Russian leader said about the scary, horrible NATO. Why not? Why not? I do not rule out such a possibility. That's my really bad Russian accent. It is with difficulty that I imagine NATO as an enemy. Who said that? Yeltsin? Nemtsov? No, Putin. Why would Putin want to join an alliance allegedly threatening to destroy Russia? Makes no sense. After the second wave of NATO expansion was announced, a Russian strategist said this. We, of course, are not in a position to tell people what to do. We cannot forbid people to make certain choices if they want to increase the security of their nations in a particular way. Who said that? Kasparov? Navalny? No, Putin. On Ukraine, NATO, a Russian policymaker said this. I am absolutely convinced that Ukraine will not shy away from the processes of expanding interaction with NATO and the Western allies as a whole. Ukraine has its own relations with NATO. There is the Ukraine-NATO Council. At the end of the day, the decision to be taken by NATO and Ukraine, it is a matter of those two partners. Author? Yep, you guessed it. That's Putin again. At a NATO summit, yes, a NATO summit, a Russian said this. The period of distance in our relations and claims against each other is over now. We view the future with optimism and will work on developing relations between Russia and NATO in all areas. Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Nemtsov? No. That was Medvedev in 2010 at the Lisbon NATO summit, 2 years after the dreaded 2008 Bucharest NATO summit. I know, inconvenient facts, but these are direct quotes from Putin and Medvedev. But carry on with your myth-making. So there you go. Interesting selection of quotes that show that there's a great understanding of what NATO is all about, and trying to blame NATO is a bit short-sighted. Okay, this is the BMP Terminator that we saw. I've shown you videos of it shooting trees and stuff. Everyone, should be a bit scared of the Terminator. The first one has just been blown up. So this is the first confirmed kill of a Terminator. This is the vehicle. And they're all pretty excited about that. And there've been all these videos of them shooting things. See the range of that all the way down there, and then there it is. That's it could well be the same Terminator they're taken out. Anyway, that's good for the Ukrainians. Bit of a PR blunder there for the Russians. And finally, I'm writing an article on the Nord Stream thing at the moment. I know some people are calling me out on do you really think it's America's fault? And I'm compiling all the evidence for each for blaming each side, if you like. And at the moment, in the evidence I've compiled and looked at, I would side with US has more to gain from Nord Stream getting stopped than Russia has to gain. But I'm not hugely, I'm not particularly bothered either way. I need to think of the morality of it all. But I having looked at a whole bunch of stuff most of today, that is where I think I am. But we need to disconnect ourselves from what we want to be true and for what we think the ramifications of that entity being responsible might be. We need to just have a look at the evidence and look at sort of cui bono, like who's to gain most from it. And I'm fairly sure that the US has the most to gain by quite a margin from it. But that's not to say they definitely did it. And there are arguments either way. But yeah, expect an article on that in the next few days. It does take a bit longer to put those big pieces together. And this is on Elon Musk and Starlink. But I have a feeling, I've gone on too long. So I'm going to have to leave that for tomorrow. Oh, well, there you go. Something to look forward to tomorrow. Anyway, thank you so much for your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. And all the ways you can support the channel are in the descriptions below. Sorry, I've been banging on for too long today. That's me. Take care. Speak to you soon.